guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have some comic and manga recommendations. So I do frequently get asked for which manga and comic series I recommend. I have to say, when I was putting together this list, I've pretty much gathered, I normally do 5, but if I was doing 5, I wanted to do manga or comics, and when I was gathering everything together, I haven't actually read that much. So all of the ones I'm going to be mentioning today are going to be manga and comics that I have read and really enjoyed. So not necessarily my favorites, but just ones that I personally think are really good. So we have 3 comic series, and for manga to talk about today, we'll start off with the comics and the one that doesn't really need me to recommend it, which is Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This one is an incredibly popular comic book series. Every time I go into my local comic book store, I ask them if they have any recommendations for me that are as good as Saga, and I always kind of get a response that is similar to nothing is as good as Saga. But this one is a sci-fi series that follows a young couple who are from warring factions. It's kind of like Romeo and Juliet in space. So Alana is from a planet and Marco is from one of the planet's moons, and the moon and the planet are at war. So they met when Alana was a soldier, and if I remember correctly, Marco was a prisoner, and they fell in love and they had a baby. And this story is told from the perspective of the child, detailing her parents' life together and also her story. So there are 9 volumes in this one so far. I believe it's going to be 18 volumes in total. The creators have just come back off hiatus. They've been on hiatus for 2 or 3 years now, I think, and they've currently started working on it again. So if you want to get into this one, now would be a pretty decent time, as you won't have the really long wait that people like myself have had when we've been waiting for volume 10 in this series. But I really love this one because it is very emotionally impactful. I cried, I think, about 3 times throughout this series. The characters are extremely lovable. It's also extremely funny. It does have like graphic and explicit content, so do be wary of that if that is something that you don't like. But this is just a very emotional series that has some good points of action as well, and absolutely stunning artwork. One of the ones that I've been talking about pretty recently is Rat Queens by Curtis J. Weeb. The earlier installments in the series are illustrated by Rock Upchurch, but this goes through quite a few different art style changes up to the point where it's at now, where I think volume 8 is the most recent one, and I have read 6 volumes of this total so far. So this one is a adult high fantasy comic series that follows 4 boozy battle maidens for hire who have gotten into one bar fight too many and they're thrown into jail, and to get their freedom they have to complete quests for the realm. So the majority of the volumes in this series are very quest based, so you will have like the start and end of whatever particular quest they're working on, and then you will also have little bits of backstory to some of the characters and also things that tie into a little bit of a greater plot scattered throughout there as well. I really like the art in the earlier editions of the comics, but I do also like the artist that they moved on to from here, and then the one that they're using at the minute I currently like. They had like a weird more watercolor style throughout the middle that I wasn't a huge fan of, but I do find that if I take a little bit of a break between the installments, I don't notice the art changes so much. And while I know why they've been changing artists, and it's like a completely valid and good thing that they have changed artists, I am somebody who is incredibly picky about art style. If I don't like the art style of a comic, I won't pick it up. But my favorite thing is the characters. There are more Rat Queens that are added later on, but the 4 original ones, which are Dee, Violet, Hannah and Betty, are just amazing. They all have very different personalities. They add different things to the team. They're all from different races as well, so it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons or an RPG style of comic. We have Betty, who is a smidgen with a heart of gold, and she is always high. We have Dee, who is supposed to be like this religious cult leader, but she ran away. We have Violet, who is a dwarf, and then we have Hannah, who is like the borderline evil sorceress. We have a ton of representation in here as well. There's a female-female relationship with Betty throughout this. I believe Hannah is bisexual. There is a trans character that's added to the main cast later on as well, and this one is incredibly funny. I laugh out loud at so many points throughout this series. So if you're looking for like badassery and characters who don't give a fuck. Like, they're always drunk, they're always fucking things up, but they really love doing it, and it's really funny along the way as well. And just to prove how very little comic book series I've read, the last comic that I'm going to recommend is the Buffy reboot. Now, I'm very specifically recommending this for people who are fans of the original Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show. Now, I will say that when Buffy first aired, I was 3 at the time, so maybe it's skewed towards the kind of younger people who are a fan of the main show, but I grew up watching Buffy. I used to watch it when I was really young because my mum was watching it, and through high school I used to watch 2 episodes every night. So when I saw this reboot, at first I didn't understand why Buffy was being so heavily publicized, because I thought that this was one of the canonical comics, but this is actually a modernized reboot. It still has like a 90s vibe to it, but it is a modern vision on the original. So I have only read this first volume so far, but I do plan to read through this and its spin-offs at some point, and then bring you kind of like a reading guide to this comic as well, because the more popular it gets, the more spin-offs it's getting. If you're unfamiliar with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, to start off with, it originally started as a movie in, I think, the very early 90s. The movie completely flopped, and then they picked it up as a TV show, and it is about this young girl called Buffy who is a vampire slayer, and she really doesn't want to be. So in every generation, a slayer is born, the one person to fight back against the forces of darkness, but the way that the show is crafted, every supernatural thing that they encounter is kind of a metaphor for the things that teenagers have to deal with when they're growing up. So in this reboot, it is, I think, like 2018-ish, so all of the characters are modernized. There is some outdated representation in Buffy, like some of it hasn't aged particularly well, and all of that has been kind of reimagined, so it's much more diverse than it was. One of the characters who's queer in the show a little bit later on is queer right from the start, and I am incredibly sensitive to Buffy related things because the show means so much to me, but I think they did a really good job with this at bringing the characters to life, so that if you are a fan of the show, you can read this in the voices of the characters and actors that originally played those characters. And they've also brought characters from, for example, Angel, and plot lines from Angel, and also characters that appear much later on in the Buffy series, and put them right in the beginning of this reboot. So we have like Wolfram and Hart, which is a big evil corporation from Angel, introduced in this very first volume. Anya is in this first volume, who only turns up in season 2 or 3 of Buffy, but only becomes main cast like season 4 or 5. Drusilla and Spike are in this right from the beginning, and we also have Robin Wood, who is only in season 7 of Buffy, who appears as a teenager with everybody else in this first installment. So if you are a fan of Buffy, I do think that you will enjoy this like me, especially if you are around my age, where as you have been growing up, you were slightly out of sync with Buffy because you were a lot younger than they were at the time that it was aired. This one is a good middle ground where the characters are in a more similar environment to what you would have grown up in. And also, as a side note, for if you are looking to get into the Buffy comics, there are currently 2/3 spin-offs. The first one is Angel, which, as I mentioned, is kind of related to the Angel TV show, but after volume 2 of this, it stops being Angel and starts becoming Angel and Spike, although it is a continuation of this one. And the brand new one, which I picked up at Forbidden Planet and apparently isn't out yet, it may be out a couple of days after this video is posted, but that is Willow, which is a spin-off of one of the characters from Buffy. So moving on to the manga, I have 4 manga to recommend to you guys, but I do just want to kind of say before we get into the recommendations that I have seen plenty of reviews from people that say that they find the elements in manga to be slightly problematic, like various seasons have various issues. All of the series I'm going to recommend today do have problematic elements, and because I've read a little bit of manga now, I believe that the problematic elements are problematic seen from a Western lens. So when I go into manga, I bear in mind that this is translated from an entirely different culture that have a very different set of beliefs and way of living. So things that may seem problematic to me may not be problematic to the culture that these things have stemmed from. And also it's worth bearing in mind that it normally takes a couple of years to translate things. So some of these manga, especially because some of these are quite well known, are a little bit older, like 15 years old, which could also contribute to those problematic elements. But I've come to kind of expect it from manga now, so I kind of overlook those facts and take the things that I enjoy from these series. You are also going to notice, very strangely, as I'm a fantasy and sci-fi reader predominantly, that when I read manga, I much prefer contemporary manga a lot more than I enjoy normal contemporary literature. So the series out of these I guess I kind of like the least is the only fantasy one, and that is Children of the Whales by Abi Umeda. And I wouldn't say that this necessarily has any problematic elements, but this one is like a new adult aged fantasy manga series that follows a young boy called Chakuro, who is the archivist on the Mud Whale. The Mud Whale is this big island that floats along on the sea of sand, and all of the residents of the Mud Whale have never seen another human being from outside of their community. That is until one day they float past another small island and decide to scout it for supplies, which is something that they do quite regularly. And on this island they find the first human that they have ever seen from outside of their own community. This throws open their world entirely, and I picked this manga series up because of how beautiful the art style is. It has a very cutesy style of art, but it is consistently stunning throughout the entire series, with absolutely beautiful attention to detail and stunning character art. So I was expecting quite a cutesy kind of fantasy story in here, but there are a lot of like brutal elements and elements of massacre in here that I wouldn't expect. So the age rating on this says older teen. I tend to go with like new adult, because while a lot of it has like teen themes, there is that extra element of brutality. So 100% my favorite thing about this is the art style, but I also really enjoy the characters in here and the grim morality. I also like the unreliable narration and how you're gradually learning things with the characters, because with this being a manga to start off with, it is set in a fantastical world, but on top of that, all of the main characters that you follow have a very limited understanding of the world, as they have known nothing outside of their own community, which means that the plot twists really do come as a shock because there's no kind of precedent for them. But as the community is so isolated, they don't come as a shock in a way that they're not plausible, because the characters have no way of knowing the truth with how isolated they are. I will say that there are quite a few dips in this series. At the point where I'm at, which I think I'm around volume 7 or 8, there are currently 16 at least volumes in this series, but I'm around halfway. The characters are currently on their way to somewhere, and it seems like a long time that they've been on this journey and they haven't arrived, so it does tend to lull like that. And there are a couple of volumes that kind of take it away from the plot and are more slice of life on the Mud Whale, which I definitely enjoy less. But I do think that this one would be a good one to read if you're new to manga as well, because it is very easy to follow, and despite it being fantastical, it has quite an easy to follow and simple narrative. Moving on to the contemporary one that is kind of a standalone that I really love is I Want to Eat Your Pancreas, which is by Yoru Sumino. This one is, I say it's a standalone. This is a bind up of like multiple volumes, but this is like the entirety of the series, and this one is a young adult contemporary story from the perspective of a socially awkward boy. One day, I think he's at the doctor's office, like he sees a book and he picks it up and starts to read it to see what it is, and it turns out that it's his classmate's diary, and she is dying of pancreatic cancer. He is now the only person outside of her family that knows that she's dying, and when he gives her diary back and she finds out that he knows, she kind of latches onto him because she wants somebody to kind of share the experience with, that she doesn't have to be overly happy around, but she doesn't want everyone to know that she's dying because she doesn't really want people to treat her differently. So this is a very like emotional story, and you know it's going to be emotional going into it, but there is also quite a few plot twists in here that I really enjoyed, one of which took me completely by surprise, did not see it coming. I was actually kind of horrified at it, but like the shock value honestly was worth it. So if you're looking to try contemporary manga, this may be actually a good one to start with, because it is just this one chunky book and then you're done. One that I probably should have started with because it is like one of the most popular manga is Orange by Ichigo Takano. This one has 2 chunky volumes like this, and this is the entirety of the series. So this one is a contemporary with a sci-fi twist, and it follows a young girl called Naho who receives a letter from her future self that tells her that if she doesn't do something, like if she doesn't change the things that her future self regrets about the past, one of her classmates will not be with her like by the end of the year. They will have gone. So this story follows Naho as she befriends this new classmate and starts to actually believe, because at first she thinks it's a prank, but she starts to actually believe that her future self has really sent her a letter, and she's trying her hardest to rectify her future self's past mistakes. I really love this series because of the characters. It is just so cute and so sweet, and I love the relationships between all of them. While this predominantly follows Naho, she has a group of 4 friends who are also very deeply involved in this storyline, and I really loved reading about the group dynamics. You also have this like huge thing of what is going to happen, like how is this classmate going to be gone, like what's going to happen if she doesn't change it, like is she actually going to manage to change the timeline, that kind of drives this story onwards. Now I will say that this does definitely have problematic elements, because the way that mental health is treated in here or portrayed in here is not really a healthy way to go about it, but I just really love the friendships and the group dynamic in this one. And I also think that this has one instance of a love triangle that works really well and actually just really makes my heart hurt. Trigger warnings in this one for suicidal thoughts and behavior, and also big trigger warnings for mental health, especially depression. And the final one I have is also by Ichigo Takano, and that is Dreamin' Sun. And this one is quite a long series. I think there's 10 volumes and I've read 4 so far, and I just think this one is super cute. It's a shoujo manga, so it is essentially aimed at teenage girls, and it has a rom-com style. So the premise of this one is quite iffy, because we are following a young girl whose father has remarried. Her mother died a few years ago. Her father has remarried and they have a new baby, and she's feeling very pushed out of her family, so she decides to run away. So she meets this like 20-something-year-old guy who's passed out drunk in the park, and he offers her a place to live, providing that she fulfills 3 conditions. The first one is that she tells him why she ran away. The second is that she finds his missing house key, and the third is that she has a dream and falls in love. So straight from the premise you see why this is problematic. Like, this teenage girl finds a drunk guy passed out in the park, apparently hasn't heard of stranger danger, and ends up moving in with him. But in this house that she ends up moving into, there are also 2 boys who live there from her class, and this kind of reminds me of like a young adult version of New Girl, where the people who live in this house have a really weird dynamic, I guess. The main character quickly develops a crush on one of the boys who lives there, who's generally just like a really nice guy, and then the other boy who lives there is kind of like the comedic relief of the series. And then you also have the landlord, who is just like perpetually grumpy. So I really like this one just because it makes me feel good. It's really cute, it makes me really happy, it makes me laugh in parts. It does have some issue with things like fat phobia, which I do believe is a recurring theme throughout manga, and something that is still incredibly common in Japanese culture, but it is present in this, so I thought that I would let you guys know. But overall, I just find it really sweet, cute and funny, and it never fails to put me in a good mood. So that is it. Those are my comic and manga recommendations as of now. Please let me know down in my comments if you have any manga or comic recommendations for me. It is something that I'm not incredibly experienced in. Like, I haven't read a whole ton of comics and manga at this point, but I'm always up for broadening my horizons and finding new series, especially for things like contemporary manga specifically. And also, if you have any recommendations for comics that are better than Saga, I believe it's quite challenging, but if you do, please let me know that down in the comments as well. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find links to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.